Hey everybody, Mr. Wagstaff here. Cool junk to talk about today. Alright, so today we're going to be talking about the Crusades and how it fundamentally affected Europe. So, it goes down to religion, alright? That's one of the reasons that we started this unit talking about the different monotheistic religions. Specifically today we're going to be talking about Christianity and Islam. Even though the two religions are a lot more similar than a lot of people realize, it doesn't take a lot for people to justify a reason to attack each other. All right, there's going to be a whole bunch of battles in which Christians are going to go to the Middle East and attack Muslims. All right, atrocities are going to take place across the board. The reason is for political power. As crazy as that is not surprising. A motivation for a lot of wars that happen in the history of the world. So that's what we're going to start talking about today. All right. So there's a handful of crusades. There's like 6 of them, 8 of them, depending on how you want to divide them up. So we're going to hit the main ideas of it and what the lasting impact of what's called these crusades are. So Christians live in Europe, or Europe is a predominantly Christian area. Jerusalem, which is in Israel, is controlled by Muslims. Now, if you remember from the story of Abraham that we started this unit off on, both Muslims and Christians believe that Israel has been promised to their people, all right? And that the other group, right, is wrong for thinking that. So there is going to be multiple attempts to march armies from Europe down into the Middle East and take Jerusalem away from the Muslims and make it a Christian city. There are multiple, for over a couple hundred years, and just ridiculous amounts of people died doing this, and the Christians were never able to take over Jerusalem. So they're going to lose every single time. Now, why would this happen? Well, it goes back to the Pope. It is a power grab by the Pope. All right. So Pope Innocent II and King Philip II of France. So King Philip II is the king of France. There are some people who live in France that are not Christians, called Albigensians. The Pope is going to team King Philip II. Now, the Pope doesn't necessarily have an army himself, but if he says, I need people to come join my army I'm going to decide to make right now, guess how many people are going to show up? A whole bunch, because this is the Pope. This is the man who can decide whether or not you go to heaven or not. So if the Pope wants an army, he gets a big one. So the Pope teams up with King Philip II to wipe out the Albigensians in France. This is exactly what happens. A huge army comes together. They wipe out this whole religion. Again, they're just killing people because they're a different religion. This is in France, in Europe. And once this happens, the Pope realizes that he's very popular. When you're the head guy in a war that you win, you're really popular. And what better thing to do as a Pope than fight a religious war? So the Pope starts looking for religious wars to fight so that he can gain his own personal power over the Christians and get even stronger. Even though he's one of the most powerful men, if not the most powerful man on earth, he wants more power. And it's not just him. There are the Crusades last hundreds of years, and it's a succession of popes who do the same thing, who are declaring war on Muslims to try to take Jerusalem back, in large part just to gain political power. All right. So they keep getting armies together, and they keep trying to march to Jerusalem and to take over Jerusalem. And again, they're never able to do this. Now, these are just some weapons of the Crusader, just shields and swords. There's no fancy technology. People are just getting hacked to death in the middle of fields for these battles, fighting over religious lands. The Pope, while he is not a king, basically uses his authority to force kings to fight. As we saw what can happen if a king like King John in England that we had talked about in the last lesson decided, no, I don't want to listen to you. then the Pope can excommunicate the entire population, and then they stand up to the king and take power from the king. So the king realizes once the Pope says, we're going to fight and you're going to get an army together to go do it, the Pope has, or the king has to do this. So the Pope is able to use religion to manipulate kings to do whatever he wants, because if the king said no, the Pope could threaten to excommunicate the people of the king, kick them out of the church, knowing that's going to cause the people to attack the king. So the Pope is, at the time, is trying to gain more power by forcing the kings to do what he wants them to do in order to go down here and try to take back Jerusalem. And that's what the question is that we just got done talking about. So make sure you answer that in complete sentences. So as we talked about, and there are tons of courses to go through these Crusades, and there's a bunch of amazing and horrific fashion of things that happen during these Crusades. The Christians are never able to take Jerusalem. It's too far of a march. It's too far. There are some major impacts once the Crusades are over, though. While I'm blinking around there. While the entire focus was so the Pope could get more power, completely backfires on him. And a large reason why it's going to backfire on him is every time you march a whole bunch of people off to battle and then you lose, you lost a whole bunch of soldiers. Guess what all those soldiers were? They were Christians, devout Christians that are willing to die for your cause. And you were just having your devout Christians get slaughtered over and over and over as you're slaughtering Muslims as well. And with all those people dying, the power of the Pope actually goes down. People start to question for the first time, wait a minute, if God told the Pope to do this, wouldn't we be winning? So it actually completely backfires on the Pope, and he's actually going to lose some power because this is all the Pope's idea. And while it's Pope Innocent III, there are multiple other popes that come out after him and before him and have the same mentalities. So it does completely backfire because it kills a whole bunch of Christians. Now, here is one of the more surprising, historically speaking. So the Crusades last hundreds of years, right? And once they're done and they don't try to attack anymore, the outcome, some of the results a couple hundred years after the Crusades are really surprising because they're really positive for England. And not necessarily just England, but Europe in general. It is a very positive outcome from them. And you're like, positive? How? That's how historians and everybody's kind of shocked about it as well. So here's a map, all right? If you notice, all these lines are places people had marched. If you remember, all right, let me get a mark here. They had divided in half the Roman Empire. So we've really just been talking about these countries over here, England, France. We haven't talked a whole lot about Germany or anything yet. These are the countries that we've been talking about. And these countries here, on this part of the Roman Empire, hadn't really talked about them. They had kind of split in half. So this group here, they only trade with each other. This group here, they only trade with each other. The Middle East here, if you see Jerusalem down here in the corner, they only trade with each other. So once these people start marching, once they start marching here all the way across, right? All the way down here to Jerusalem and then back, and then, oh, it doesn't work, and they come back, and then they have to try a new route. Hey, let's go by water. Let's go all this other stuff. All these crusades, all these marches down there, they had to find routes to get there. There's a lot of times they had to build roads to get their armies there, right? And then it's a horrible slaughter fest, and everybody dies, and it's just horrific, and everybody has to run back home. You know what got left? Those roads that got built, those paths, those water routes, those maps that got developed on how to get those armies there. All of a sudden, once it's over and everybody's not trying to kill each other anymore, they're like, hey, there's random roads here. Let's go over here and trade from one side of the world to the other. There is now roads, trade routes open up. And as crazy as it sounds, there is actually a whole lot more connection between the Middle East, which is down here. This is kind of the top of it, of the Middle East. The Middle East would be over in this area here. there is now roads that connect the Middle East all the way out here to Europe, and obviously from Europe back to the Middle East, and they can start trading. And there's a lot of spices, there's a lot of goods that actually open up between those two cultures, and the two cultures merge together actually a lot more. There's a lot of benefits that will benefit Europe by opening up these trade routes that were developed because they had to build roads to get armies there in the Crusades. So looking back on it, like, everybody's like, the Crusades are absolutely horrific idea across the board, but there's a whole bunch of benefits for Europe after the Crusades are over because it opened up trade, and there's so many more goods, and it really increases a lot of positive things in European society and in Middle Eastern society, who can now get goods from Europe as well. So it's kind of a shocker that, with as awful and as unpopular as the Crusades were, have such a positive outcome with having the ability to trade afterwards. Alrighty. So those are the two questions here. If you haven't already got it, and again, as always, if you get here in the video, pause it so you can go through and answer these. I'm not going anywhere. 27, how did the Crusades, which are used to try to strengthen the power of the Pope, backfire and actually weaken their power? We talked about that in detail. And then 28, explain how the Crusades actually increased trade between Christian Europe and the Muslim Middle East afterwards, that introduced desirable changes in both areas. And we talked about that in great detail. All right. The 100 Years' War. Guess how long this thing lasts? You're right, 100 years. It actually lasts 113 years. Now, spoiler alert, it's England and France again. England and France go to war all the time. So the 100 Years' War is very influential because it changes warfare to get to a more modern style warfare that we have. Prior to this, when there was warfare, it was usually knights that are trained to go out and fight other knights, and then if one group of knights got defeated, oh well, they just owned the country, and serfs go back to working. Well, now it's after the Magna Carta, all right? There is some more ownership held by the people in these countries, on top of other things, and the fact this war is going to last 113 years. This is the first time you're going to have peasants and serfs that are going to join a military and go fight. It's going to be called total war. This is not just between knights. This fundamentally changes warfare, and it is you're fighting for a way of life. Very different than the way these other big wars had happened in the past. Between France and England, I'll get that picture here in a second. I need to tell you the story behind that. So France and England, war breaks out. It's 1337. All right, this is after the Crusades are over. There's a couple really cool stories that I'm going to tell you that I think you'll like. So the cannon was used for the first time. All right, instead of just using swords, they got new weapons. All right. The cannon, absolutely extremely effective weapon on water because it shoots cannonballs, which is an iron ball, all right? And you try to shoot it at the bottom of other people's wooden ships, punch holes in it, and sink it. The whole exploding cannonball thing does not come out for a really long time. They always like to show that on movies, and it's not true. You're just shooting like a shot put at them. And you're not trying to shoot the people on the deck. If you're in a naval fight, you're not trying to blow the people off the deck. You're trying to punch holes in the bottom of their ship to make their ship sink. All right. So cannons start being used for the first time in the 100 Years' War. There's another one, and you'll really like this story. So, have you ever wondered if you give somebody the finger, all right? It is a sign of disrespect. All right. Have you ever wondered where that came from? Like, why if you give somebody the middle finger, all right? It is incredibly disrespectful. But if you're like, hey, and you hold up your pinky, like, nobody wants to fight you over that. But if you give them the middle finger, people get worked up. So at some point, somebody had to decide, we're going to have the middle finger be a sign of disrespect. You may have never thought about, where did that come from? I'm getting ready to tell you that. And it actually came from the 100 Years' War of all places. So England had developed a brand new weapon, the longbow, in the 100 Years' War. So the longbow is a little longer than most bow and arrows, which has the, what you would expect, intended benefit of being able to hit things further away because it's longer, more tension. The French couldn't make longbows because they didn't have the same type of wood that the English were using for their longbows. So it was like just an English way of doing it. When you go to war with somebody for 100 years, there's going to be a lot of prisoners, all right? Well, if you keep capturing prisoners, eventually you just have to feed them all. And you just have, like, because you capture prisoners, and then when do you release them? When the war is over, all right? Well, when you're at war for 100 years, the war never feels like it's going to end. So you had to figure out a way to not have to worry about these prisoners, or just kill them all. Well, that seems crazy. Yeah, that was not a preferred method of doing things, ever, regardless of what movies will tell you. So the longbow, the archers, all right, were terrifying to people. So what they would do when the French would catch longbow archers, all right, their main goal was just they don't want this guy fighting anymore. So what they would do, all right, is instead of like putting them in jail or whatever, they would take their hand and they would just cut off their middle finger. Because if you think about it, if you're pulling back a bow and arrow, you can't do it, right? With the longbows, you can't do it without having your middle finger, all right? So they would just cut off the middle fingers and send them back, all right? And that way they know that, hey, yeah, this guy lost a finger, he'll go live his life, but he can't be an archer anymore. There's a story, all right, that comes out near the end when a group of English longbow archers get surrounded at night. So they're like kind of down in this hole, and they get surrounded by French military. They get surrounded by them and obviously know that they're going to be captured, but it was getting dark and nobody fights at night because you can't see anything. There's no lights. So the whole night that as they sit there, the French have the English longbow guys surrounded, and the whole night the French are taunting them and all this other stuff, and you know, yelling at them about, you know, we're going to cut your fingers off, or, you know, all you know, whatever they're going to do all night. Well, the next morning, more English reinforcements show up, all right, and surround all the French. So the French get captured, all right? And so once the French get captured, they have to like part to let all those longbow guys that they were taunting in the middle of the night out from the little ravine that they were in. As the English longbow guys are walking past all the French guys that were capturing them, they're sitting there taunting the French guys now by giving them the finger, by showing them the finger and saying, ha, 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 you didn't take off my finger, like, you know, blah, blah, blah. But that is the original place where using the middle finger as a taunt and as a disrespectful symbol comes from, is from the 100 Years' War between England and France with the longbow. The other really cool story that comes out of the 100 Years' War is the story of Joan of Arc. So the Joan of Arc story is just, it's crazy. Like, it seems completely made up. There's enough made up stories, you know, like Sword in the Stone and like Night of, you know, the Knights of the Round Table, and all these stories that are exaggerations. And Joan of Arc, if you're not real familiar with it, kind of gets thrown into their color where it seems like, oh, it's like dragons and stuff, like just like supernatural stuff. Except Joan of Arc's story is true, and it's still it's crazy no matter how you look at it. So Joan of Arc is just a peasant girl, right? She's a teenager. And she shows up, so the war is not going super well for the French here later on in the 100 Years' War. So she's a French girl. And she goes up to her lord and she's like, hey, God's been talking to me. He says, let me lead all your troops into battle and we'll win. I mean, first off, this is a female, all right? They weren't allowed in the military at all. And she's like, put me in command of people. And she has no military training. She's just a peasant girl that lives on a farm. And they're like, no. Really long and really intricate, cool story later, jumping ahead, she does find herself in charge of some troops. She wins every single battle. And she does like the complete opposite of what you think she should do. She does the complete opposite and wins. And they're like, how did you win? How did you know they were going to do that? She was like, God told me. And she says that God was talking to her the whole time. And it is, and she becomes super famous, not only to the French. They're like, we have this woman who's out here just wrecking shop as a commander, knowing exactly what the English are going to do it. The English are very aware of her, and they are terrified of her because she keeps winning. Without her, like, the French wouldn't win anything. So finally, and she's not like in charge for a real long time, I think a couple years. She finally ends up being captured by the English. And now, when you're like an archer or something, they cut your finger off or whatever, or like they put you in jail or whatever, with her, this is what the picture was. They burn her alive at the stake, all right? This is like not typical of what you do when you capture people back then, but they burn her alive because they claim she's a witch. And a lot of the reason for this is going to be it hurt a lot of men's egos. Like, there's no way a woman could be coming out here and defeating us unless the devil is helping her. And if you're like, well, she says God's helping her. Everybody's so egocentric. The English are like, God's on the side of the English, not the side of the French. So she must be evil. But so Joan of Arc comes out of this very, very famous story, and it's a true story that she just comes from nowhere, gets put in charge of soldiers, and just starts winning and doing stuff that none of the veteran French generals can do. She just happens to always know exactly what's going to happen all the time, and that's probably a big reason why actually by the English is just out of fear of what she can do, and it's an ego thing as well. Oh, there's no way that she could possibly be defeating men unless, Satan was helping her. All right, so the question here is, what is fundamentally different about the 100 Years' War than every other war that England and France had fought? This is the whole total war idea. This wasn't just knights. You got people like Joan of Arc that found her way into the a peasant woman found her way into the military. It fundamentally changed war, that it wasn't just elites fighting elites with the jousting and stuff like that. This is peasants. These are serfs. These are the average people going out to fight for their country. And this concept of total war is really going to change how wars are fought then. Because if you're like, hey, I got 50 knights, like, well, I got 73 knights. And that used to be how you decided what wars would be. Now it's like, I've got 2 million people. I've got 3 million people. And all of a sudden, wars just get a whole lot bigger when you start counting peasants as a possible fighting force. All right, that's as far as we're going to get today. I will see you guys tomorrow.